The drawing-room at Stourbridge House held its breath that afternoon in the way that only old rooms can hold a breath. Not from cold, but from waiting. Cecily Vane lifted the teapot and poured. She poured for Lady Margrave first, as propriety required, though her hand did not tremble and her eyes did not flick to the man seated nearest the window. She poured for Miss Arabella Croft, who accepted the cup without thanking her, which was also propriety's requirement in a room where a governess was present to serve rather than to be noticed. She poured for the Earl of Stourbridge, who sat at the head of the gathering with the particular stillness of a man who made rooms quieter by entering them. And then, last, with a care that looked like deference and was something else entirely, she poured for Mr. Harland Fitch. He took the cup, he lifted it. He did not yet know what was in it. Cecily sat back. She had been waiting for this afternoon for 4 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days. She had not spent that time in anger because anger required the luxury of certainty, and she had not been certain until 11 days ago. She had spent it in patience, which was the one quality the world had tried to teach her, and had not managed to diminish, and in care, which was the quality the world had managed never to see. She folded her hands in her lap. One pause. She watched the fire. The careful blend was his. After all, she had only kept the teapot warm. She had arrived at Stourbridge in the 2nd week of November, when the last of the Cheshire oaks had let their leaves go, and the estate grounds lay under a thin grey light that made the stone house look less like a home and more like a declaration. The Earl's man of business had written to her father's solicitor, who was now her solicitor, which was to say Mr. Ferker. Alderton, at the bottom of 3 narrow stairs in Holborn, who handled 3 or 4 cases of similar character, women in reduced circumstances, with sufficient education to be of use to households that could not quite afford a fashionable companion. The position was governess to Master Thomas, the Earl's ward, age 9, whose parents had died in the spring and who had been brought to Stourbridge without anyone quite asking whether Stourbridge was prepared to receive a grieving child. And Cecily had met Thomas first, before she met anyone else of consequence, because he had been sitting at the bottom of the great staircase when the footman brought her in from the rain, and he had looked up at her with the specific expression of a child who has spent 6 months being looked at with pity, rather than directness, and had concluded from this that grief was something adults preferred not to see. She had sat down on the stair beside him in her damp traveling cloak, and had asked him what he was reading. He had told her it was nothing. She had told him that nothing had a title, and he had showed her the spine. She had heard the footstep above them on the gallery before she looked up, and she had not looked up for a moment after she heard it, because the Earl of Stourbridge had been standing there, and she was not yet prepared to be assessed. She had been assessed, regardless. To the household, she was just the new governess, which meant she was temporary, and to Lady Margrave, who came to Stourbridge every November and remained until February, on the grounds that the winter journey from her own estate in Suffolk was too taxing for a woman of her years and her constitution. Lady Margrave said so in a low voice to Mrs. Agnes Holt, the housekeeper, on Cecily's 3rd morning, not unkindly so much as accurately, from within a set of assumptions she had held for 60 years, without occasion to revise. "A fanciful creature," Lady Margrave said, glancing toward the morning room where Cecily was setting out Thomas's lesson books. "One hopes she lasts the season. They so rarely do." Mrs. Holt had said nothing to this, which Lady Margrave took for agreement. Mrs. Holt had known Cecily as a child of 7, when Mrs. Holt had kept house for the late Mr. Vane before circumstances moved her north to Cheshire. She had said nothing because what she knew about Cecily Vane was not something Lady Margrave was ready to hear. The month of November passed in the way of months that have no particular mercy to offer. Thomas progressed from reading reluctantly to reading in the evenings, without being asked. The Earl observed this from a distance that he apparently considered sufficient for a man of his character, and did not comment on it, though Cecily caught the faint shift at the edge of his attention twice in the first fortnight. A glance held a moment too long at the doorway of the morning room, a stillness in the corridor when she was reading aloud to the boy that lingered 3 breaths beyond what was necessary for a man passing through on his way to his study. She noted it, and she did not permit herself to read it, because she was in no position to be mistaken about what cold men held in their attention, and she had been mistaken once already. There was a morning in late November, a Wednesday, when the frost had come in the night, and the morning room windows were filmed with cold, and Cecily had been reading to Thomas from a history of natural philosophy that was perhaps 3 years above his station, but that he was absorbing with the particular voracious quietness of a child who has recently discovered that the world is larger than his grief. She was reading about the behavior of rivers in winter, about the way ice forms first at the edges and works its centerward, and Thomas had interrupted to say that he thought it was strange that ice should begin where the water moved slowest and work toward the middle where it moved fastest, and she had said that perhaps it was not strange at all. That perhaps stillness was the first condition of a different state, and he had considered this with a frown, and then said he thought she was talking about more than rivers. She had laughed. It surprised her. She had not laughed properly in 8 months, and it came out at an angle she had not expected, and she had put her hand to her mouth, and Thomas had looked at her with the particular satisfaction of a child who has caused a good thing to happen. She did not know until later that the Earl had been in the corridor. She did not know until later what he had heard or how long he had stood there. She found out only because Mrs. Holt told her, 2 weeks afterward, that his lordship had asked the housekeeper whether the new governess had always had that quality, meaning the laugh, or whether it was recent. Mrs. Nediac. Holt had told him she believed it was the first time in some months. He had said nothing to this. But he had asked, a week after that, whether Thomas was progressing. He had not asked before. It was in the 2nd week of December that Mr. Diz. Harlan Fitch came to Stourbridge. He arrived by private carriage, which was not the vehicle of a man arriving at his solicitor's summons, but the vehicle of a man arriving at his welcome, and Lady Margrave was on the front steps before the footman had time to arrange himself properly, which told Cecily everything she needed to know about the preparation that had preceded his visit. She was in the upper gallery with Thomas at the time, looking down through the window at the grey gravel, and when the man got out of the carriage, she put her hand against the cold glass and felt the air leave her body in one long, controlled release. Thomas looked at her. "A cold draught," she said. "Continue with your passage." She had last seen him in the office of her father's estate 3 weeks after her father's burial, when he had produced a document bearing her father's signature that showed a debt of £300 owed to his firm, a debt for services rendered across the preceding 4 years, a debt that represented, as it happened, nearly the entire liquid remainder of the Vane estate after the funeral costs. The document had been dated and sealed and witnessed by a clerk whose name she did not recognize, and whose address, when she later attempted to write to him, did not exist. She had told Mr. Alderton her belief that the document was forged. Mr. Alderton had looked at the signature, which was her father's, because Fitch was careful, and he had told her that her belief was understandable and not legally operative. She had gone home that evening and opened her father's Bible because she did not know what else to do, and she had found, pressed between the pages of the Psalms, a letter, not the forged document, a draft of a letter in her father's hand, addressed to a Mr. Dew, Cornelius Aldgate of Gray's Inn, not Fitch, seeking advice about his will's execution and referencing, in the 3rd paragraph, his specific instruction that no debt instrument should be valid without his countersignature on a separate page, a private arrangement he had established with Aldgate years before any trouble arose. The draft was dated 3 weeks before Fitch's document. It bore at the bottom a note, in her father's precise, careful hand, original sent to C. Aldgate, the 14th of March. She had folded it and placed it in her stays. She had not told Mr. Alderton. She had not told anyone. She had waited. If you have stayed with this story through its quietest hours, you already sense what she was building. Stay a little longer. By the end of Fitch's first week at Stourbridge, Cecily understood the architecture of his visit. Lady Margrave had spent years as a faithful correspondent with useful solicitors, and Fitch had cultivated her with the same efficiency he applied to all his arrangements. He was being positioned as the Earl's man of business, the current steward being elderly and considering retirement, and he had brought with him a set of credentials attesting to his reputation in 3 counties and a portfolio of the estates he managed, all of which he was content to let Lady Margrave present on his behalf, which meant Lady Margrave's social investment preceded the Earl's approval and would make disapproval more costly. It was, Cecily observed, a very careful blend. She was in the library on the afternoon of the 14th when the Earl came in. She had not been expecting him. She was reorganizing the estate's correspondence files at Mrs. Holt's request, a task beneath her station and outside her position that she had accepted because it gave her 3 days of proximity to documents she had no other reason to examine. She heard his step in the doorway and rose, and he said, "Do not stop," in the flat, level voice he used when he meant what he said. And so she did not stop. He sat in the armchair by the window. He watched her work. She was aware of him in the way she was aware of weather, not with alarm, but with a kind of full-body attentiveness that had nothing to do with her intention. "You are not comfortable here," he said after a time. "I am very comfortable, my lord." "You are watchful," he said. "That is not the same thing." She said nothing. She placed a letter in its folder. He said, "Is there something I should know about Fitch?" She looked at him then. His face was turned toward the window, his profile against the gray December light, jaw like carved stone and eyes the color of smoke, and she noted the particular quality of his stillness, which was the stillness of a man who had learned to ask questions at moments of his own choosing and wait without moving until the answer decided to arrive. "Not yet," she said, and she turned back to the files. He left when the candle burned low. She listened to his footstep on the stone, and then listened to the silence he left behind, which was its own kind of presence. She stood where she was for a moment longer than was necessary, her hand on a folder of correspondence she was not reading. And she was aware of the warmth that the armchair by the window still held from his presence, the impression of him in the room that a fire and a candlestick can hold for a few minutes after a person leaves. She was also aware that she had not told him what she knew, and that not telling him had been correct, and that she did not know yet whether there would be a moment when it became right. These were not comfortable thoughts, but they were honest ones, and honesty was the one currency she had not managed to spend down. She put the folder away. She locked the correspondence cabinet. She carried the candle to the door. She did not permit herself to think about his hands, which had been flat on his knees, or about the quality of attention with which he had watched her work, which was not the attention of a man who was passing time. She did not permit herself to think about these things, because she had been wrong about cold men before, and because being wrong again in this particular house, in this particular situation, would cost her the only ground she had left to stand on. What Edmund Ashford, Earl of Stourbridge, carried in his breast pocket was not a letter from a woman or a keepsake of the dead. It was a document, a written account, in the hand of his household physician, Dr. Renwick, attesting to the negligence of a doctor. Graves, who had attended his brother William through the illness of the previous winter, and who had, in Renwick's considered medical opinion, administered a preparation that suppressed the fever's expression rather than addressing its cause, and who had advised against the additional treatments that might have altered the outcome. Renwick had written the account at Edmund's request within a week of William's death. Edmund had carried it for 9 months. He had not filed it with the medical board. Not because he did not believe it, but because Dr. Graves was a man of considerable standing, connected by family to a bishop, and Edmund had been told, in the cautious language of people who managed the feelings of men with power, that a complaint without irrefutable proof might go badly, that standards of evidence were difficult, that perhaps it was grief speaking rather than certainty. William had been 31. He had been the better brother, by common agreement and by Edmund's own. He had died in the 3rd week of February. Edmund had stopped extending courtesy to uncertainty after that. It was Thomas who showed Cecily this. Without knowing, he did. The boy had found him one evening in January, standing before the portrait of William in the long gallery and had said nothing, only taken his guardian's hand in the silent way of children who understand sorrow better than they understand words for it. And Edmund had stood there for a long moment with the boy's hand in his before he brought himself back to the room. Cecily had not witnessed this. Thomas told her about it in the matter-of-fact voice children use for things they do not yet have categories for. She had put down the book they were reading and looked at the fire for a moment. "He is a good man," Thomas said, with the certainty of 9. "Yes," she said, "he is." She set the book down and looked at the portrait Thomas had described. She could not see the long gallery from the morning room, but she knew from the house's layout, where William Ashford's portrait hung, had passed it twice, and she had noted the particulars without meaning to, the way she noted everything. The painted face was younger than Edmund's, softer in the set of the jaw, with the particular expression of a man who did not yet know which decade would take him. Thomas was watching her. "Do you think he is sad?" Thomas said. He meant the Earl. She considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "I think he has something to resolve," she said. "I think he will resolve it." Thomas seemed to find this sufficient. He picked up his book. She picked up hers. The fire settled in its grate. Outside the window, the January frost made the estate grounds bright and hard and very still. She felt, in a way she could not quite name and did not try to, that she was sitting at the edge of something that was working toward its center. That evening, she wrote to Aldgate at Gray's Inn and asked whether he had in his records a letter dated the 14th of March of the previous year from a Mr. Dwall. George Vane of Holborn concerning the management of an estate instrument, and whether he would be willing, should the matter become pressing, to attend in Cheshire at reasonable notice. His reply arrived in 8 days. It was a short letter, precise and without embellishment, in the hand of a man who had practiced brevity for 40 years and found it served him. He confirmed that he had received the letter from Mr. Cava. George Vane dated the 14th of March. He confirmed that it had been accompanied by a signed instrument establishing the countersignature protocol. He confirmed that no debt claim against the Vane estate had been presented to him, and that had one been presented without his countersignature, he would have considered it irregular. He added in a second paragraph that he had read with interest the circumstances she described, and that if she believed a fraud had been committed against the estate, he would be prepared, should the matter become actionable, to present his records to any court of appropriate jurisdiction, or, should she prefer a more discreet resolution, to attend in person at a location of her choosing and verify the dating by direct examination. He signed it simply, Aldgate, Gray's Inn. She read it twice. She held it very carefully in both hands, in the way one holds something that has been a long time coming. She put it with a draft in her father's Bible. She closed the Bible. She placed her hands flat on the cover and sat for a moment in the complete stillness of a person who has found the last piece of something she has been looking for, and now must decide precisely when and how to set it down. Then she went to teach Thomas his geography lesson, and did not think of it again until she needed to. The dinner at which the second dismissive label was spoken happened in the 3rd week of January, when Lady Margrave had arranged a gathering of the county neighbors, ostensibly for the new year, and in practice to allow Fitch to be seen in easy company with the Earl, and to allow Miss Croft, who arrived with her mother, to be seen in close proximity to both. Arabella was 22, and possessed of an absolute certainty in her own legibility. She knew precisely the figure she made in the candlelight, and she arranged herself accordingly, and Lady Margrave watched her with the satisfaction of a woman who believes she has laid out all the relevant elements. Cecily was present as Thomas's governess, which meant she was not present at all in any social sense which suited her. She had brought the paper. She did not produce it during the soup. She did not produce it during the fish. She produced it during the interval between the remove and the dessert, when Lady Margrave was in the middle of a sentence about Mr. Genton. Fitch's management of the Helcourt estate, and how beautifully he had untangled the late Viscount's rather unfortunate obligations, because this was the moment when Cecily understood that there would not be a better one, she said quietly, from her place at the lower end of the table. "Forgive me, my lady. Mr. Fitch managed the late Mr. Vane's estate as well, did he not? The table went still in the way. Tables go still when someone who is not supposed to speak has spoken. Lady Margrave turned. She looked at Cecily with the expression of a woman who has just discovered a piece of furniture has addressed her. "I beg your pardon," she said. "He produced a debt instrument after my father's death," Cecily said. "I have a document here that was written before the debt instrument. I wonder whether someone with knowledge of legal dates would care to look at both." Fitch's face did not change. That was the measure of him. His face did not change at all. "My dear girl," Lady Margrave said in the voice of a woman who has handled 30 years of social difficulty, "that fanciful creature has been making allegations since her father's unfortunate financial circumstances became known. I would caution his lordship against attaching weight to the grievances of a woman in a reduced situation." She turned to the Earl with a warm finality, the fan in her hand held at the half-inch that signaled authority. "Shall we go through to the drawing-room?" Edmund had been watching Cecily. He had not taken his eyes from her face from the moment she spoke. She felt his attention as a pressure across the table not unkind, and she did not look at him because she was watching Fitch. Fitch set down his glass. That was the only thing he did. He set down his glass with a precision that was not calm. She folded the paper and put it back in her pocket. The dinner continued. The room recovered itself gradually, the way rooms do when something unexpected has happened, and the assembled company must decide what to do with it. Two of the county neighbors resumed their conversation about shooting and weather. Miss Croft asked Lady Margrave something about a ball in March, and Lady Margrave answered without turning her head, because her attention was on the Earl, who had not spoken since Edmund set down his own glass. He looked at the table for a moment, and then he looked at Cecily, and she met his gaze directly and steadily, and she read in it what she had been waiting to read since December, the plain evidence of a man revising his understanding of a situation he had thought he had already understood. He did not speak to her that evening. She did not expect him to. In a room full of people, in front of Lady Margrave, in the specific social arithmetic of a dinner party at which she was present in the capacity of a servant, there was nothing appropriate to say. She walked back to the upper rooms with Thomas when it was time, and she sat with him until he was settled, and she went to her own room and sat by the small fire until it burned down. She was not afraid. She was, if anything, more certain than she had been before. The dark moment came 3 days later. Miss Arabella Croft, who had extended her visit by 5 days on her mother's suggestion and Lady Margrave's encouragement, found the Earl in his study at the hour between afternoon calls and dinner, and told him with a sympathy so practiced it read as genuine concern, that she had heard from Lady Margrave that the governess had been telling the servants a story about a forged document, and that her ladyship was worried about the disruption to the household, and that Mr. Breeder. Fitch himself had confided that Miss Vane's father had indeed died owing money, that the family had disputed the debt out of grief rather than evidence, and that the matter had been settled at the time to the satisfaction of the appropriate parties. "She is a fanciful creature," Arabella said, not unkindly. "I do feel for her. These reduced situations produce such a kind of unreliable resentment." Edmund was silent for a moment. "Thank you," he said. The words were level. He sent for Cecily that evening. She came to his study, and he told her what had been said, and he watched her face while he said it, the way he watched everything. Without preliminary, without kindness as prelude, because kindness as prelude was a form of management, and he was not managing her. She stood before his desk in the plain gray gown she wore for evenings, her hands still, the fire behind her casting her shadow long across his floor. "You think I am lying," she said. "No," he said. "Then you think I cannot prove it. I think you have one document. I think Fitch has one document. I think a man of his experience has prepared for exactly this situation." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "I have 2 documents. And I have written to Aldgate of Gray's Inn, who holds the original." He was very still. "Why have you not told me this before now?" "Because until 3 days ago, "I did not know what Fitch intended here," she said. "I only knew what he had done to me, and I could not bring a complaint against a man in your household based on what he had done to a governess, with no property and no address of consequence. It would not have answered. You would not have had reason to believe me." He looked at her for a long time. His face did not tell her what he was thinking. His face rarely did. His hands, which were flat on the desk, pressed down slightly against the wood, and his jaw set in the way she had learned to read as a man holding something down that wanted to rise. "I am sorry," he said, "that you were placed in a position where you had to calculate whether you would be believed." She did not know what to do with that sentence. She looked at the fire. "Mr. Aldgate has agreed to come," she said. "He will be in Nantwich by Friday. If you would see his letter, I have it in my room." "I would see it," he said, "and I would very much like to know why you have been carrying this alone since November." She looked at him then. His face was turned toward her. Directly, for the first time, all the careful management of expression abandoned. And what was there was not rank or cold authority, but something more specific and more human. A man who recognized what it looked like to have evidence and no one willing to receive it. Because he had stood in that place himself, and he had not acted, and his brother was dead. She said, in a very quiet voice, "Because the only thing more dangerous than a careful schemer is a careful schemer who knows you are watching." Something shifted in his face. It was small and precise and entirely sufficient. He rose. She rose with him, which was propriety, and he walked to the door, which was procedure, and then he paused with his hand on the doorframe and turned back to her. "You have been very careful," he said. "I had to be," she said. "Yes," he said. The word was quiet and complete and did not attempt to enlarge itself. He left. She stood in the study with the fire still going and the candle burning steadily, and the particular sensation of a woman who has set down something heavy that she has been carrying for a long time and is aware, in every joint and muscle, of the weight that is no longer there. She stood like that for some moments. Then she found that she was no longer standing but sitting in the chair by the fire, and that her hands were in her lap, and her eyes were very hot, and she was not going to cry, because she had not cried since the night she found the letter in the Bible, and she did not intend to start now. She looked at the fire. She breathed. The days between then and the gathering were 3 in number, and each of them passed with a particular charged quality of days that know they are before something. The Earl was in his study more than usual, and in the dining room less. He sent a note to Nantwich on Wednesday morning, and on Thursday evening a carriage brought a lean, elderly man to the house, who stayed in the east guest room, and asked for nothing but a pot of tea and a good candle. Aldgate. She had recognized him from the window. She had gone to sleep that Thursday night with her hands folded on the Bible, and had slept better than she had in 4 months. If you have stayed this long, you already know what was coming. You knew it from the moment she set down the teapot. The gathering in the drawing room, 3 days later, was Lady Margrave's arrangement, designed as an occasion to formalize Fitch's appointment before the other county solicitors heard of it and complicated matters with professional objection. She had written the invitations herself. She had planned the morning's business as a matter of courtesy to the assembled neighbors, who would serve as witnesses to the Earl's decision, which she considered already made. Fitch sat nearest the window with his portfolio of documents in the particular confidence of a man who has run this particular scene before and knows all its exits. Miss Croft was there. 3 county neighbors were there. Mrs. Holt stood near the door, at Cecily's quiet request, which had been conveyed via a single sentence left on the housekeeper's desk the previous morning. And Mr. Bratter, Cornelius Aldgate of Gray's Inn, 63 years old, dry as parchment and twice as durable, sat in the chair that had been placed for him at the Earl's specific instruction, in a location that Fitch could not have anticipated because he had not been told. Cecily poured the tea. She poured it with the care she brought to everything, and she set each cup in its place, and when she had poured for Fitch and he lifted his cup, she sat down and folded her hands and looked at the fire, and she breathed. Lady Margrave opened the gathering with a speech about stewardship and responsibility and the importance of securing the estate's legal affairs with a practitioner of demonstrated character. She spoke warmly of Fitch's record. Fitch received this with the modest gravity of a man who knows the speech was written for him. He produced his portfolio and laid it before the Earl. The Earl looked at it. He did not open it. "Before we proceed," Edmund said, "I would ask Mr. Aldgate to present something." Lady Margrave stopped, her fan in her hand held perfectly still for one breath. 2. Fitch's cup was still at his lips. Aldgate produced a letter from his inner pocket, the original of the draft Cecily's father had sent him, dated the 14th of March, signed and countersigned, attesting to the private instrument by which no debt claim against the Vane estate would be valid without Aldgate's independent verification. He produced, from the same pocket, his own record of no such debt having been presented to him, and his own written opinion, composed in the week since Cecily's letter, that the debt instrument Fitch had filed against the estate was inconsistent in its dating with the protocol Vane had established. He set both documents on the table beside Fitch's portfolio, and laid his hands flat and waited. The room was very quiet. Cecily did not look at Fitch. She looked at the Earl, who was reading Aldgate's documents, with the same deliberate attention he brought to everything, one page at a time, without hurrying. The county neighbors were looking at each other. Lady Margrave had placed her fan very carefully in her lap. Miss Croft was looking at the window, as though it had become very interesting. Fitch set down his cup. He set it down and said in a voice of managed calm that the countersignature protocol had not been in force at the time of the debt in question, that Mr. Vane had modified his arrangements in the final year of his life, when his affairs became complicated, and that if Mr. Aldgate had not been informed, that was a lapse in Mr. Vane's own record-keeping, for which no one could be held responsible. Cecily reached into her pocket. She took out the folded paper she had carried since the night she opened her father's Bible. She set it on the table. She said, "This is a draft of the letter my father sent to Mr. Aldgate. You will find the date at the top. It is 3 weeks after the date you have given for the modification you describe." She said nothing else. She sat back. Fitch looked at the paper. He did not touch it. A man of his experience would know better than to touch it. The room understood, in the slow, collective way of rooms that have been waiting without knowing they were waiting, that something had arrived. One of the county neighbors cleared his throat. Lady Margrave looked at the paper on the table, and then at Fitch, and then at the Earl, with an expression that Cecily would later think of as the face of a woman whose certainty had just been asked to account for itself, and found the question unexpectedly difficult. Edmund rose from his chair. He rose and he crossed the room. Not to Fitch, not to the table, but to Cecily. And he stood before her, and he said in a voice that was level and that carried to the corners of the room without effort, "Miss Vane, will you remain?" She looked up at him. His face was not stone now. It was something more particular than that. "Yes," she said. He turned to the room. "This estate's solicitor is Mr. Sefton. Mr. Fitch is dismissed." 12 words, no more. The silence that followed was the kind that does not rush to fill itself. Fitch rose from his chair. He gathered his portfolio with the controlled movement of a man who knows that everything watching him is watching. For the moment he loses control, and he did not give them that because he was careful, because he had always been careful, because careful was the only quality he had ever truly had. He walked to the door. He opened it. He went through it. The footman closed it behind him. "Lady Margrave," said Edmund in a voice she had not used since he was 12 years old, which was the voice of a woman who is beginning to see the shape of what she has participated in. "Aunt," he said, not unkindly, "I think we would all be grateful for some air." The room began in the careful Regency way to rearrange itself. Aldgate approached the table and gathered his documents with the precise efficiency of a man of Gray's Inn, who has done what he came to do and is satisfied. He paused at Cecily's chair. "Your father," he said, "would have expected nothing less." He moved on before she could answer. Mrs. Holt, who had been standing near the door through all of it, met Cecily's eyes once, and her expression said everything that 60 years of keeping house had taught her to say without words. The room settled into its smaller conversations, the careful negotiations of people determining what they had just witnessed, and what they had always thought about Mr. Fitch, which were in several cases not quite the same thing. Lady Margrave sat very straight in her chair with the fan in her lap, unopened, and said nothing for a long time. At the window Edmund stood alone for a moment. Cecily saw him put his hand to his breast pocket, a gesture so small that no one else saw it, and then let his hand fall. She understood what he had been carrying. She understood what he had failed to do and what it had cost him, and what it cost a man of his character to have recognized. In a governess with no property and no address of consequence, the same thing that had lived in his own breast pocket for 9 months, evidence set aside because the world counseled patience with men of standing. And a brother who had died while the patience ran its course. She sat by the fire for a long time after the others left the room. He came back when the others had gone and sat in the chair across from her, and they were quiet together for a space of minutes that did not require filling. He said, "I should have listened to you in November." "You listened to me on Tuesday," she said. That was when it mattered. He looked at his hands. He said very quietly, "There is a matter I should have acted on last year. A document I should have filed. I have been sitting with it for 9 months, telling myself the evidence was uncertain." She looked at the fire. "Is it uncertain?" she said. A long pause. "No." "Then file it," she said. He looked at her. The fire was warm between them, and the room had recovered its breath, and the winter outside the windows was the specific kind of still that follows something large moving through. It was not then that he said what needed to be said, because these things are not said in drawing rooms. On the afternoon of a reckoning, with the shape of the morning still visible in the arrangement of the chairs. They were said in the weeks that followed, in the library, and in the corridor, and in the garden. When the first February light came back and made the stone house look less like a declaration and more like a home. They were said in the small increments that people use who have learned not to extend courtesy to uncertainty, but who understand that some things require the patience of someone sure of what they are waiting for. Thomas was present in the indirect way of children for most of it. He took no great notice of the fact that Miss Vane stayed at Stourbridge, past the date when governesses typically found occasion to move on. He simply assumed it, in the way that children assume what they have already decided to be true. By March, the physician's account had been filed with the appropriate board, through a senior clerk of Gray's Inn, to whom Edmund had been introduced by Aldgate. The process was slow and procedural and uncertain in its outcome because these things are, and Edmund walked it with his jaw set and his eyes level and did not look away from any part of it. The document came back to him in April, not as a verdict, but as an acknowledgment of receipt and the opening of an inquiry, which was not justice, but was the beginning of the road toward it, and he sat with it in his hands in the study, and was still for a long time. Cecily had come in without knocking, which was something she had stopped apologizing for in February, and she had stood beside his chair and looked at the document with him. His name was William, he said. He had never said it to her before. "I know," she said. His hand, which was on his knee, turned over. She put her hand in his. They sat like that until the candle burned down. The Bible is on the study table now, beside the window that looks out over the February-turned-April garden where Thomas is at this moment doing something entirely unsuitable to his good coat that no one has yet noticed. The folded paper is inside it, not in the Psalms, but at the front, in the flyleaf, written between her father's name and her mother's, in the small neat hand that is the record of who the Vanes have been. It is not proof anymore. It is a keepsake. The fire is lit, as it has been every evening since November, and the room is warm, and the light is the particular warm gold of an English spring evening, when the long winter has finally decided to be finished. Cecily did not pour triumph. She poured tea. She sat back. She let him drink what he had brewed. Some things only work when you do not touch them. She had learned this from her father, who had left the record because he trusted that the record would outlast the man who tried to overwrite it. He was right. He usually was. She carries his Bible to remember it. If this story has moved you in some way, leave a word for Cecily in the comments. She waited long enough to earn the hearing. The April light is still on the garden. Thomas is still destroying his coat. Edmund is at his desk and is not frowning at the correspondence and is, Cecily thinks, on the particular edge of something almost like ease. She pours his tea. She does not sit back this time. She sits forward beside him, her hand near his hand, and the garden is full of light.